Why is inequality going up? Well, one is, I told you a little while ago that the rich are getting enormously richer. The very rich are getting enormously richer to the point where they can't spend the money. I did a small calculation of how long it would take to spend the money. If you buy a Ferrari every month, and Elon Musk wouldn't even notice the difference. In many countries, not all actually, I'll come to that, in a really exceptional point in the history of inequality. For a range of countries, that includes China, India, Japan, the United States, Korea, and of course many other countries, the inequality that we measure now, let's say measured by the ratio of the incomes of the top 10% to the incomes of the bottom 50%, are at historical highs. They've never been this high since we have measured data. Doesn't mean that 600 years ago it wasn't higher, but since we've had data, so in many countries that data goes back to 1900. And since 1900, we are now at global heights of inequality. Is this inevitable? Well, the countries which are not following this trend, they are actually countries like Mexico, Brazil, Indonesia, Morocco, Nigeria. These are countries where you don't follow this trend. Inequality is actually going down in these countries, or flat. It's striking that these are countries which historically have had very high levels of inequality, and inequality has been a big social problem in these countries for a long time. Other fact that is very striking is that the timing is quite specific. The inequality falls in all the countries I mentioned at the beginning till 1980, and then goes up. Now what happens in 1980? I live in the US, so it's maybe an overly US-centric perspective, is that Ronald Reagan becomes president of the US, and Margaret Thatcher becomes Prime Minister of the UK in 79. And the first thing that immediately happens is that the marginal tax rate, the tax rate on the rich, in the US goes from 70% to less than 40%, immediately. That was part of the Reagan program, so is not saying that there's a secret. This is what was meant to happen. The reason they done it was that growth was slowing in these countries. The fast growth period from about 1945 to 1972-73 stops, and the countries are worried that growth is stalling, so they decide that they have to increase inequality. To do that, inequality goes up massively, as I said. Growth does not. Growth remains it goes down and stays down. Across the world, you can look at the correlation between changes in inequality and changes in growth. And I have some research on this, and there is no correlation. There is no relationship. If you look at the level of inequality and the level of growth, do more unequal countries grow faster? The answer is no, they grow slower. But maybe that's spurious, but certainly there's no evidence that increasing inequality promotes growth. Why is inequality going up? Well, I think there's several things happening. One is, I told you a little while ago that the rich are getting enormously richer. The very rich are getting enormously richer to the point where they can't spend the money. I did a small calculation of how long it would take to spend the money if you were buying, let's say, a car every month or something, and you couldn't spend the money by buying an expensive car every month. You could buy a Ferrari every month, and Elon Musk wouldn't even notice the difference. They cannot spend the money. That's why they are spending money on going to Mars, because there's no other way for them to spend the money. Wealth share of income. How much of your income is coming from wealth? Then even for the top 1%, increasing share of their income is coming from wealth. It's not coming from their labor, it's not coming from their job, it's not coming from their skills, it's coming from their wealth. Structure of global trade is another thing. As inequality, so in a sense, these are vicious cycles. As people get richer, they can't spend the money, so they get even richer. As people get richer, they demand higher quality goods, they demand branded goods. And as they demand branded goods, the companies that control those brands, and I don't necessarily just mean Samsung, I mean all the companies that are in that supply chain of Samsung, but still a small set of companies are getting huge economies of scale. They're growing extremely fast. The global set of global brands are growing faster than the global economy by many times. The last piece of that story is that if you look at what's happening to elite education, it's getting incredibly expensive. All over, there's a global demand, and that's a consequence of the fear of AI. The fact that if you don't have elite skills, you won't have a job. And so elite education everywhere, the price is growing much faster than global GDP, and as a result, only the rich can afford it. There's an article in New York Times yesterday saying that if you look at the people with the same SAT scores, the rich, the children of the top 1% are 2.7 times as likely to be admitted to an elite institution than the average, and for the bottom 20%, that's 20% less than the average. From AI to a sort of a demand for elite skills, and from elite skills to elite schools, and a mechanism for exclusion. What do we do? I think first thing is we need to change the tax treatment of AI, of investment. And the investment is subsidized. New investments many countries subsidize investments. Investments right now taking from AI. So the substitution of AI for workers is actually tax subsidized. Secondly, the tax subsidy is actually very largely underestimated, because when a worker loses his job, the state supports him. That's not in any capitalist calculus. And therefore, the 25% of the worker's income or 30% of the worker's income that the capitalist, now he doesn't pay the worker, worker has been fired, the state is taking care of him, that 30% is also a tax subsidy effectively. So we're really we have a very distorted pricing of AI. Second, I think we have to directly take on wealth accumulation. Wealth taxes and estate taxes are needed, and to do that we need to think of tax havens. I think there should be a global agreement to ban tax havens personally. I've been saying this for 15 years. There's not a lot of take up, but there's a little bit more interest now in that idea. It's really essential.